that's the biggest thing, is just kind of like not spending the emotional energy on it. It was exhausting. I don't feel like there's like pressure to decide almost anything else in my life. I can just make my way through life as it comes, do what I want when I want, see opportunities and think, I'll do that. I'll go to that place for 6 months, or I'll do this, because I'm not thinking, oh, but what if I then want to have a child, and then, will me and my partner be in the same location to raise a child, or all of those kind of things. So I think it's really great to have just a bit more peace around it.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. You folks know I love having authors on this podcast. And let me tell you, I have a real treat in store for you today, because I'm speaking with none other than Rose Diell, who is the author of the brand new book, Fledging. Brand new being it's just released in the last 6 to 8 weeks. I had the privilege of reading this book, and this is a fiction book for fence sitters. It is about who you will hear today, the protagonist, Leah, who lays an egg, a giant egg. And she's like, what happened? What am I supposed to do with this? And although the story itself sounds a little bit fantastical in nature, the dilemmas and the push and pull, the sort of tug of war that Leah experiences as she navigates her Kids Are Child-Free choice, I'm sure you will find very relatable. And of course, we're going to be hearing about Rose's own story. Did she grapple with this Kids Are Child-Free decision? Is that why she was able to write such a highly relatable book about being on the fence? What does Leah eventually decide? Well, you'll have to pick up a copy of Fledging to learn that, but we will be hearing from Rose about what her decision is on this Kids Are Child-Free path. So without further ado, a little introduction to Rose. Rose Diell was born and raised in London, but her heritage stems from various places beyond the British Isles. A lover of language in all its forms, Rose speaks French, Italian, and Arabic, and has lived on 3 continents. Rose writes in her spare time with the encouragement and support of her writing circle, the South Bank Scribblers. She now lives in London again with her civil partner and Tolstoy, an extremely fluffy ginger tabby. Fledging is her first novel, and today we're going to be talking all about her fantastic first book. Thank you for joining me today, Rose. I am very excited to learn about your story, because I think actually out of all of our guests, I know virtually nothing about you except perhaps, and I'm not going to ask you this question right now, but I'm curious how much of your own life story and experience has perhaps been mirrored in your book, which we're also going to be talking about today, which was just released in the last couple of months, called Fledging. So perhaps you can just let us know a little bit about yourself to start. And then, of course, I want to talk about this book and what this book is about. So who is Rose and what is Fledging?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me today. So I'm Rose Diell, and I'm an author. I'm based in London. I've always wanted to be an author, so the book coming out in August was just like so exciting. And so it's my debut novel. It's not necessarily the first novel I've ever written, but it's the first one that's being published. So really, really excited about it. And yeah, a lot of people have said, is it autobiographical? And I can confirm that I have not laid an egg.
Okay.
But the book is about a woman in her mid-30s obsessing about whether or not she wants to have children. And I can confirm that I have also been a woman in my 30s obsessing about whether or not I want to have children.
Yeah. Okay. And so in this book, the protagonist, Leah, does lay an egg. I feel like I can say that because it's on the back cover, and like this is the opening scene of the book. Which, by the way, I don't know if anyone has ever given this parallel, but for some reason there was something a little bit like Metamorphosis, Kafka's. I think it's Kafka's Metamorphosis. As far as this, it sounds fantastical, right? Like people listening are like, "Sorry, she laid an egg. What's happening?" And it reminds me of that book and the fact that somebody is like having this totally otherworldly experience, and yet the emotions they're feeling and everything else in life is seemingly normal. I don't know do I frame that accurately?
Yeah, I think so. I'm kind of it's kind of embarrassing, but I only read Metamorphosis like a few months ago.
So it's fresh in your mind.
I've heard of it. I'd heard of it. And
I didn't love it. And I loved your book, by the way. So it's different in that way.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is. And as you say, I like Metamorphosis in terms of how creative and interesting it is, whether I kind of identified with it or took the same things. I think it's probably a bit more literary as well, maybe slightly less accessible than
definitely less accessible.
But definitely I was inspired by other. I do love. I mean, as a kid growing up, I always read fantasy. I loved reading fantasy, and I used to write fantasy like as a child, writing my stories. And then kind of as a teenager, I got all kind of moody, and I was more like existentialist, and I just wanted to write about real life and real emotions. And then I think now as an adult, what I've kind of started trying to do more is combine those two things. So kind of real life emotions, that kind of slightly more literary angle with the hints of magic and the surreal. So the book that I did read before reading Fledging and kind of partly directly helped inspire it was The Vegetarian by Han Kang, who's actually just won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Oh, wow. So I have to read this book.
Well, I think the Nobel Prize, it's a bit like a lifetime award. You don't get it for a specific book, unlike with the Booker or something. So I can't say if she won it for that or not, but The Vegetarian did get the foreign language Booker, I think. She's South Korean. So I've read it in translation, but that's really interesting, very surreal. It's this woman who starts off saying she's going to become a vegetarian, which is like not accepted in her South Korean society. And then as the book progresses, she starts to think she's becoming a tree. And it's very weird and surreal. And I was just very inspired by how Han Kang used that to kind of explore this real issue, which is kind of like a modern day Ophelia, or kind of exploring when women don't have agency and what impact that has on them, which isn't it relates, but it's not quite the theme of Fledging. But just that idea of a kind of surreal image or a surreal idea as the center of the story really appealed to me.
Yeah, super interesting. Always cool to hear. And something we probably don't even think that much about is like, where do writers get inspiration from? I'm guessing from reading and from all kinds of places in day-to-day life and their own lived experiences. So we're going to return to the book in a few minutes, but I want to first of all just delve into your own kids or child-free decision. And, actually a little bit funny in the sense that this is now, I think, the 38th conversation, give or take, that I've had on this podcast. And although we're constantly talking about how people make this decision, I've had relatively few people on who I would say were true fence sitters. I think most people on either side, there was like a grappling or contending with the choice. There were maybe hurdles or, mental challenges as far as like, am I going to do this thing? Am I ready? What's going to happen if I don't have kids? But I feel like pretty excited to talk to you about the fact that you really struggled and saw yourself in the middle of this decision, as did I. So tell me, going back to your younger years as a young girl growing up, being the avid reader, writer, did you picture a future as a mother and having children?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I'm definitely not that person who can say like, oh, from the day I was 5 years old, I knew I didn't want children, or I did play with dolls, and I do have my diary entries from when I was 10 where I talked about having children and things like that. I think for me, the questioning started more like as I entered adulthood, when I was kind of at university, and then in my 20s, of thinking, wait a minute, is this something I actually want? And if so, like, when would I want it? And why would I want it? And that kind of questioning. And so I suppose it's hard to know really, because I don't know if the thoughts earlier in life were like a genuine desire to have children, or just that kind of assumption of that's what you do. But I think probably they were as well. And it's definitely something I've gone back and forth on quite a bit, because I think, and I think what's great about what you do is you're not saying that there is a right or a wrong. It's just what's right for you. And obviously there's pros and cons to both paths. And I think that's what's so, I think for me, I very much see, I'm someone who often sees both sides of an issue anyway. So I definitely see that. And there's lots of things that are so important to me, like family. I love the idea of having a family, but does that mean I want a child and to be a mother?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the very things I wanted to explore in the book, because I think it's a really, really hard decision.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to show and explore why it's such a hard decision and why it's not easy. And I think people do assume if you have made a decision, that, and I think I have for, a while, but it's been growing. And I think it's that thing of, am I sure or not? Questioning yourself again. I mean, that's what I love about all of your memes. They're so funny in terms of just showing that indecision and going back on yourself. But I guess one of the things that I was particularly starting to explore when I wrote Fledging is how much of this questioning of my choice is really coming from somewhere inside myself and what I actually want versus is it just, am I just internalizing the questions coming from outside of me and from society and the expectations and all of that? Yeah, there's a few different things that I'm kind of exploring in the book. And I think it's difficult because I think if you say you don't want them, maybe sometimes people do assume it was an easy choice for you, or because I tend to say it quite confidently, and maybe it's partly like being British, we like to be self-deprecating, and I'll make jokes or about how I'm not going to have kids or whatever. And so I guess I probably come across as a bit more confident about it sometimes than I am. And I think then the risk is some people kind of jump to conclusions. Oh, it's because they don't like kids, or it's because all the terrible things like because they're selfish or this or that or that. And so I think I just wanted to show like it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really felt Leah's character and like the experience that she went through, minus the laying of an egg, in terms of the push and pull. And I appreciate the story because I think, it really does live in that middle ground in nuance, and it doesn't live at the outer edges as far as like radical feelings or views. Like not to say that she's wishy-washy, but it's not like she's a character who says, I hate children, therefore should I have kids or not? Or, she doesn't really present so much one way or the other in a way that I found very relatable. And I think these stories of seeing merits on either side of the decision, we hear too seldom, right? Because it's hard for us to understand. It's like, well, how can you be somebody who, for example, loves babies like I do and yet not want to have your own babies? Or how can you be a person who is so invested in family and not want to have children, or whatever it may be? So yeah, I feel like her character is very relatable. And I also, and no spoilers for the story, but like, I didn't feel like I knew what she was going to choose because I could see how much she felt pulled to and drawn in both directions at one time. So I'm interested. I mean, you've talked a little bit about what you hope this story to be, and I guess we haven't fully talked about why you wrote it. Like, was this story a chance for you to explore your own feelings, or would you say it was after feeling like you'd reached more resolution on your decision that you then wrote the book?
Yeah, you just said so many interesting things. I've got all these thoughts in my head now.
Okay, share them. Sorry, I have a tendency. My questions are like 6 questions in one. So
yeah, there were just so many interesting things there. Firstly, when you said you love babies, I was like, this shows how personal it is. I was like, whoa, who loves babies? Yeah. No, I mean, obviously there's a real joy in seeing a baby, like if it's a friend's baby or a relative's baby, or of just that joy. And like, there is something that I just find like insanely wonderful. Like, oh my God, it's this tiny human being. But I've certainly never felt like I love babies. And I think for me, the times that I do think, oh, that would be nice, is like slightly older kids. Like I've always said, maybe I could have a kid that's like, I just got them age 5 or something, even my mum said to me, I was never really a baby person, you're just much more interesting once children start to talk. Once you can
and for me, once they start talking, I'm like, take them away. I mean, there's an initial interest in that for me, like seeing who this person is becoming. But I think that's also where it starts to feel, not with all children, but it can feel like a lot for me, where I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. So yeah, it's so personal, right? And like we can both identify or have struggled in the same ways and yet have totally different perspectives on things. So
exactly. And then I also thought it was interesting when you were saying about the nuance and not like pushing too hard on a particular thing. Or because it's interesting, there was one publisher that I kind of discussed the book with who had an interesting comment. We kind of did some edits together, but it didn't end up publishing with them in the end. And one of their comments was kind of, don't hold back. Like there was a sense of kind of the book should be angrier, or the book should be like spikier, and that maybe I was kind of pulling my punches because I didn't want to offend anyone. And I suppose that could be true in one sense, in the sense that I do want it to be more like a bridge building book rather than a divisive book. But I also think that feedback didn't resonate in me, because I felt like, well, no, it's not that I'm not just writing it this way to be diplomatic. I'm writing it this way because I genuinely do think it's a really nuanced issues with both sides. And then I think also you said, sorry, I've just like so many thoughts sparked.
That's good.
You said about
I don't have to ask any more questions.
Not knowing which way it was going to go, which way it would go. And I think that's so interesting, because I think one thing I'm learning from different people reading it that maybe I didn't realize initially is how many different people can find things to identify with and almost project as well. And I think it's interesting that some people who are maybe more on the side of wanting kids maybe expect her to do that more, and people who don't expect her to do that more. And so there's an element of maybe projection there, or because it does explore both sides, picking out the side that resonates most to you. So I've now forgotten the actual, the question was, had I sort of decided when I started writing it?
Or are you decided today? I mean, we haven't clarified that, I guess.
Yeah. So I think I was at a stage of starting to have more clarity when I started writing it. I think it might be hard to write something like that without having more clarity, or at least some journey towards clarity. But I definitely think that writing it helped me as well. I do think there was an element of like therapy in writing the book. And I think that process, because in writing it, I had to really ask myself, what do I think about these different issues, and what themes do I want to bring out, and all of that. But in terms of where I am, I definitely, I had this kind of questioning in my 20s, but it's pretty gentle because, it doesn't seem that urgent. And then I guess it's the, people pick any age. It's like, oh, when you're 30, then you'll suddenly want a baby. When you're 35, then you'll suddenly want a baby. When you're 40, whatever. So I guess people kind of pick these totemic ages. And I think probably it did reach its peak around being 30, but it was for a number of reasons, because I think that is a bit early. Really, like, there's more time after that. But I think there are a few different reasons for me that were just quite personal, to be honest, to do with like my relationship and different choices I was having to make in life, that I think I heard someone refer to it as decision stacking, where this decision affects so many others, so you kind of feel like you have to work it out first before you can do anything else. And that's why maybe sometimes it feels like you have to take it earlier than you might actually need to, sort of biologically or whatever. So I think I was feeling a bit of that. And then that's also when my closest friends started having kids as well. And I think that was like a really, really big trigger for this questioning. I had quite a lot of time on my own at that time as well, so I guess I just had a lot of time to think. So I went through this phase of like really, really obsessing, lying awake at night till 3 a.m, going down all these internet rabbit holes, reading all the like amazing, helpful blogs out there. Wish I'd found your account. I wasn't on Instagram at the time. And so then I kind of was driven to write it. But also you were saying about where do you get your inspiration from? And I think the other thing that kind of inspired me was conversations I was having with others. And I just was really struck that at that time, like almost every time I got into any kind of deep conversation with female friends, it got onto this topic, whether it was like someone who wanted them, but, didn't have a partner or whatever. And like, again, thinking about their timelines and what does this mean? And all people like me who were questioning, and there were just like such interesting things friends one friend said, I just wish that like age 20, we could just get a fertility test that would tell us exactly whether we're fertile or not, and like till what age. And then, because she said, I'm doing all this agonizing over it, and I don't even know if I can have children. And it'd just be easier just to know, like, if I couldn't, then at least I don't have to think about it anymore. And I just thought, wow, that's so interesting. And so I was also kind of inspired by that. And I think in some ways, the book and the whole thing with the egg, and, you know, it's as much about the decision itself and how that can kind of weigh on women and what an impact that has on women in that period of your life, as it is about what you eventually decide. And I keep saying women, and obviously this is a choice for a decision for men as well. And obviously the whole question of children, you know, there's lots of men as well who really want children and can't have them, and kind of really, really suffer for that. But so I'm not saying that this isn't an issue for men, but I think it is different for women. It's quite specific because of the kind of fertility timeline is shorter. And we all know, you know, plenty of examples of men who've had children a lot later in life than most women are likely able to. And so I think that also, that's the bit that I maybe felt angry about, to reference that publisher, was I also just saw so many kind of snide and sarcastic things in like the media and even just like popular culture about like this stereotype of the desperate woman in her 30s. And as soon as you go on a Tinder date with her, like, you know, all she wants to do is ask about if she's going to have babies and that kind of thing. And I just thought it's such a kind of self-satisfied, patronizing stereotype, because and again, I wasn't necessarily feeling this. I wasn't desperate to have a child, but kind of on behalf of other women, I just thought, you know, of course men can laugh about that and judge women for that, because they've got like 20, 30 more years to think about this. They can, whereas the women around me don't have that time. They're thinking, can I take this job in another country for the next 5 years or whatever? But then if I'm single, like, what are my chances of meeting somebody there? And then will I be able to have children with them there? And, you know, all this decision stacking. And so I think in a way that was like the angry part of it that I wanted to explore as well, and just show kind of how difficult this is and how kind of time pressured it can be. I think there's another book about that called The Panic Years, which I have somewhere on my shelf.
I haven't read it yet. Yeah, I've heard it's good. It's good. And so for our listeners, you have decided not to have children, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so I was going to ask, because I love asking, I actually don't usually ask my guests this, because as mentioned, most people have like made that definitive choice, or were in some cases very clear from the beginning. I always like to assign a percentage. Would you say, you said 99% sure?
Yeah, sometimes they say 95. I think 99. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? It's not scientific.
Yeah. Well, and it's an imperfect measure of something that's hard to quantify or capture. I always call myself 99%, because I don't know, I'm like just sort of like a pragmatic person, that I guess that's the right way of characterizing myself, where I'm like, you never know. Like, I mean, I'm 42 today. I'm quite clear in terms of how I feel about this matter, and feel confident about my choice and my path. But I guess partly it also is just that number is like a representation of the fact that, can we ever be 100% sure about something? What does that mean? And of course, I've had people tell me, and I believe them when they say, you know, I'm 100% sure I don't want kids. I'm 100% sure I want to be a parent. But for those of us who have been on the fence and spent quite some time there, I think there's always going to be a small part of us that thinks, yeah, I could have had that. A part of me wants that. Part of me wants that still. So would you agree with that? Or what's your thought?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I still think about it sometimes. I still have these crazy moments of like, maybe I do want that. Never very serious moments, I would say, but it does come up sometimes. I think less and less. And I think this goes back to like separating out what you actually want versus what kind of society and media and expectations are telling you. Because I think one thing that's really helped me is just that like getting older. And as I said, like as I hit these, so I turned 35 this year, as I said, again, people like have these milestone ages, right?
Yeah.
And so again, it's like every time I reach one of these, another year, and the supposed baby fever hasn't kicked in, it's that increased confidence of like, well, if I was going to feel that, wouldn't I be feeling it by now? And so I think, you know, when I was 30, it was like, well, I don't think I want kids. But, you know, I was thinking like, look how much my life has changed since I was 25. I'm like a different person now. Who knows what I will want in 5 years' time? Whereas the longer that it like stays consistent and feel more settled, and maybe like your life maybe and your sort of personality and interests and desires maybe settle a bit as well. You probably don't change as much from the age of 30 to, well, I don't know, I haven't done it yet, but I think you're probably a bit more stable from the age of like 30 to 50 than you are from the age of 20 to 30. So I guess that as well like gives me confidence. But I think the biggest thing for me was actually relates to what you just said about like knowing what you want right now. And I think that for me, that was the most useful thing that helped me to let go of the questioning. Was just all I can know is what I want now. And I definitely know that right now I do not want children. And I struggle to picture the day that I'm going to wake up and say, you know what I want to do? I want to turn my whole life upside down and bring what I see as like this chaos and massive change and like burden into my life. And so I just was sort of like, that's all I can go with. Because I think as well, one of the biggest things that bothers like fence sitters is that fear of regret. Of like, am I going to look back and regret it? And it's kind of that whole, you know, well, I'd rather regret not having them than regret having them. And I think in terms of that sort of, well, I know what I want now, it's kind of like, well, if I'm that sure that that's how I feel now today, then it would be crazy to go do this massive thing on the off chance that I might want it in 10 or 15 years when it might be too late. And so I think I've just kind of reached an acceptance of like, I don't want it now. If suddenly I wake up in 10 years and I do, well, I'll have to cross that bridge when I get to it. Either I will look at what options are out there that are available, or, you know, I'll just have to come to terms with that. And it was really interesting, actually. I went a few weeks ago to this amazing event called Story House Childless in Chester in the north of England. It's happened about 7 or 8 years now, I think. And it is a bit more weighted to the childless community, people who wanted children but couldn't have them for whatever reason, or didn't have them. But it's open to child-free as well. And I hadn't really thought about this before I went, but one of the things that was kind of helpful to me was hearing childless people who had kind of come to terms with that and come to a state of acceptance. There were many people there who unfortunately weren't at that stage and were still really kind of grieving that they hadn't had this in their life, which was really kind of emotional and hard to kind of hear about, and I really felt for them. But there were also quite a lot of people who had wanted children, had gone through a period of kind of grieving or mourning that, and had come through the other side. And there was this great woman, I wish I remember who she was. He said she's like, stop going on radio shows and stuff, because she said too often they kind of cut or change her story. And she was someone who was infertile or had fertility issues, and then like I think tried IVF and other things, but it never worked out. And she was invited to be on this radio show. She told her story, and then it didn't make the final cut. And she said, and they kind of replaced her with a kind of miracle baby story of someone who did manage to have a kid after infertility. And she said, why did you cut me? And they said, oh, well, we needed to end on a note of hope. And she said, you know, I was like, excuse me, I have hope. And I just really loved that. And I just thought, wow, okay. It made me realize that maybe my fear of regret is my fear that I will think I'm child-free and one day I'll actually realize I'm childless. But hearing people like her speaking made me think, okay, well, at least if that ever happens, maybe I can I can be like her. I can also come through the other side of that. And that was quite comforting as well.
All right. So something that means a lot to me as a business owner, as the person running Kids Are Child Free, is when I get messages from you saying that, for example, this podcast has been the most impactful thing in helping you make a clear Kids Are Child Free choice, that you relate to the stories, that you laughed, you cried, all those good things. You're feeling along with our guests. It means so much to me. And I just want to say, if you feel any of those ways, if the stories you're hearing on the podcast are resonating with you, if this podcast has been at all helpful on your journey, and you think that maybe other people would benefit from listening, please hit pause and go leave a rating in Spotify or a rating and review in the Apple Podcast app so that more people who are on the fence about kids can discover the podcast. It is truly the best, most impactful way that you can help this podcast get into more ears, that you can help me to continue doing this work that I do and putting out this podcast each and every Wednesday. So take a second, hit pause. I will be very grateful if you do so. Again, you can leave a rating, a 5-star rating, hopefully on Spotify, or a rating and review, i.e. share some kind words alongside that 5-star rating over in the Apple Podcast app. I think those stories we see and hear too seldom, and there is this belief, first of all, which is like a huge disservice to the childless community and people struggling with fertility, is that there's always a baby at the end of the struggles. And that's something I've talked about with recent guests on the podcast, but also like not showing that there can be joy and a peaceful, happy, fulfilled life, whatever those things are you want, without children, which isn't to say, and even if you wanted them, and which isn't to say, as you mentioned, there's like a lot of grief and difficult emotion associated with that, but we need those stories as well. And I also think, certainly not to say those stories, like the Child Free by Choice community perhaps are like the last people who those stories need to be offered to, right? Like there's people who need them more. But if you have been on the fence for some time and you're really struggling, and there's even a part of you who doesn't want to have children, that's ultimately what you choose to do, to know that there's someone who wanted kids with their whole heart and soul, who has been able to build and have a life where they're at peace, or there is that sense of hope, like it should be able to hopefully offer this example of like, you can do it too. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, like, yeah. I just think it's offers a lot of maybe solace for all kinds of people with this decision. So.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think the other thing that I sort of came to understand or accept, and I think is a really big theme in Fledging, is kind of what you referenced a minute ago as well, about these kind of moments of sadness, or maybe I wish I had that, or and I didn't know the term when I was writing it, but I've since seen on Zoe posted on We Are Child Free, that Instagram account a few months back, something about cold regret. Which I think is such a helpful term that kind of captures one of the ideas I was trying to explore in Fledging, which is, again, this idea that you can make a decision and it can be the right decision, and you can still have some moments of sadness about that. Yeah. But it doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. And that's the difference between cold regret and hot regret. Hot regret is where you're like, I wish I hadn't done that, it's ruined my life, kind of thing. Cold regret is kind of acknowledging what you've lost, but still recognizing that overall you took the right path. And I think we all have experience of that in different things in our lives, because most choices in life are a trade-off. There are upsides and downsides, and maybe we move to another city, or we change jobs, or we end a relationship or a friendship, and there's downsides and sad things about that, but we know that ultimately it's the right path for us. And so I think I wanted to kind of show that, because I think the risk, if you are someone like us, is you have those moments of sadness, and then either you or people around you kind of say, well, that means that deep down you really want children and you should have had them, and but I don't think that is necessarily what it means.
Yeah. I think it just means that we can see, first of all, and I talk about this a lot, is like any decision is going to have all of the emotions and experience, not all of the experiences per se, but like, good, bad, and the ugly, that can be either path. Like we will have moments of grief or we can, no matter what path we choose. We can have moments of fulfillment no matter what path we choose. And the idea that any of these emotions like belong exclusively to one decision or the other, I think is really what gets people stuck on this decision. So that podcast episode you mentioned from We Are Childfree, and it may have been something else that you had seen, but I know they did a podcast episode about the same. I'll link in the show notes because I also thought it was really good. And it also kind of begs the question of like, because what they describe, I think, is cold regret. Like to me, that's not even really regret. That's just thinking about the life you could have had or feeling that the choice you chose isn't everything because no one choice can be everything, right? So there are going to be things that are difficult or sad or hard because that's just life. Just like there will be things that are difficult or sad or hard if you become a parent. So I agree. I thought that was also really helpful framing for me, what they shared there about hot and cold regret. I hadn't heard that. You mentioned about this book, we talked about how I found that Leah's character, it really is in the middle, and we can see things in her pull towards both sides. And you mentioned that you want this to be more of like a bridge builder versus a divisive book. I'm curious who you had in mind or who you want to be reading this. Is it fellow fence sitters? Is it the child-free community? Is it moms? Like, what was your vision with that?
So definitely my primary audience was the kind of fellow fence sitters. It was their like people like me. I want to help people like me who are going through this. And I, was really looking for books out there about this, and I just didn't find very much. I think there's a bit more of a kind of list of nonfiction works. I absolutely loved Selfish, Shallow and Self-Absorbed, like an essay collection. But in terms of fiction, there have been a few things more since kind of in the past year or two since I kind of wrote Fledging. But there wasn't so much. So there was kind of, I read Motherhood by Sheila Heti, which is like very literary. Some people have said like, is it a novel or is it an essay? And for me, it's more of an extended essay. I mean, again, it's wonderful, but it's more of an essay. And I read Olive by Emma Gannon, which I really liked as well, but for me just wasn't kind of exactly the book I was looking for. So I think, I mean, I've talked about this with a few people. There's different books for different people. And I guess I was looking for the book that would really, really speak to me. And so then I kind of ended up writing it and thinking, well, there must be others out there who this will speak to as well. And I'm primarily a fiction reader. I primarily read fiction. I do read some nonfiction. But I've always loved, as I said, like novels. And so for me, it was that there should be a novel that really explores this and, explores the particular angles that I think are of interest. So I think that's who I wrote it for. But I was mindful when writing it that, others would also read it. And I think what I don't like is on social media, as so often happens on social media, how people end up in this kind of polarized, overly combative position. And it's almost like a who's right and who's wrong. And it's like a competition for whose life is the most fulfilled and all of this kind of thing. And I just don't see it that way. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about individual personal choices, and it's a personal choice like any other. And no one's going around saying, well, if you're an accountant, you're right, but if you're an estate agent, you're wrong, because we recognize people have different careers, interests, partners, whatever. And so in most areas of life, we can kind of accept that there's different choices for different people. For some reason with this, we don't seem to accept that. And it's like, oh no, everyone must do this. This is the way. And, if you don't do it, you're going to be miserable. So I think I wanted to avoid that right and wrong. I was very conscious of that. I was also conscious of like how people would interpret Leah. I think that too often, if you don't want kids, there's a bit of a like, what's wrong with you? Or you ask yourself, what's wrong with yourself? Is it something in my childhood? Is it this? Is it that? And like, firstly, if that is your reason, if you had a difficult relationship with your mother or whatever it is, I don't think there's anything also wrong with that. Perfectly valid. We're all the result of our experiences and our upbringing, and etc. So again, no one would kind of say that that's an invalid reason to do anything else. Yeah. So it's fine if there is some kind of trauma or difficulty in your past that is the reason. I don't think that should undermine your decision. Yeah. But having said that, I did kind of I was conscious of what the typical kind of accusations might be. And so I was also kind of, when writing Leah, I was trying to avoid those. And I think as much as possible, just show this as a personal choice, that people are different. It's a personality thing, rather than having to kind of psychoanalyze or pathologize, like there must be something wrong with her for her to feel this way. So that was a really big thing. But I think what has been really interesting is I think I did possibly see it as a bit of a niche book that would only be of interest to the kind of fence sitters, or maybe the child-free, who were thinking that they, were going to do this thing that's against the norm. And so I kind of really thought that was the main target audience, and I wasn't really sure how much broader appeal it would have. But actually, it's been so nice since it's come out. Like, I've had such interesting reviews from mothers as well. I just saw my mum's friend yesterday who's had obviously she's older now, but she had like 4 kids, and she was just raving about the book and how much she liked it. And I've got a friend who had a kid really young who also said it spoke to her in different ways. So I think that's been really interesting for me, and really like kind of moving as well, and nice to see, because I think it's about that, whether for parents who do like also see the downsides and have wondered and kind of found that interesting, or maybe reassuring kind of some of their feelings, or just because they never felt that way. Like I have a friend who is one of the people who just always knew that she wanted to have kids, and that was just like what she was going to do, and she never questioned it really. So for her it was more of a, wow, I've never really understood why people wouldn't, and like it's so interesting to understand where someone's coming from who is questioning in that way. So I think it's like, maybe it's becoming more bridge building than I anticipated, which is nice.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I mean, we read all kinds of books about people who've made different life choices than us, or who have felt different ways or had different experiences. So it's funny how we feel like, or maybe have the inclination to think that a topic or category like this would be only reserved for the people who've experienced or who are going through the same or similar things. So
yeah.
Something that I found interesting is that in the book, Leah's partner's out of the picture, so to speak, because he's traveling for work while she births the egg and is, on the fence trying to figure out, like, what am I doing with this? What's going to happen next? What's my decision? And I'm wondering if, like, was that sort of symbolic as far as the sense of, let me say for myself, and I'm curious what your own experience was, but even though my partner and I both had a lot of conversations and he was very supportive of me making the choice that was right for me, he also very much was like, yeah, you got to make the choice that's right for you. So I'm wondering if that was sort of like representative of like the loneliness that she maybe felt, or having to do it on her own, or was it just a choice as far as storyline because it was easier to like leave him out of this plot, if you will? Like, I don't know. I guess I'm wondering like what the reasoning with that was.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of what you said. I mean, it's not quite my situation. My partner doesn't want kids either. Fortunately, we're kind of aligned on that. Although that sometimes has been one of my sources of questioning, because I think he's more sure than me. So then I have and we've been together quite a long time, and then I have the questions of like, am I just influenced by him? Like, what do I really want?
I hear that from a lot of women. So I'm sure there's heads nodding listening to this conversation.
But I do think, I mean, one of the things in the book that I wanted to explore as well is the concept of the default. And I do, when I have those thoughts, I kind of, and I sometimes wonder if people around me think as well, like, oh, it's just because she's with him, like if she was with someone else. But I sometimes think, wait a minute, if I was with someone who wanted kids and I was having kids, no one would say, oh, is it just because he wants kids that she's having him? They just assume that that's the normal thing to do. And actually, sometimes then I feel so grateful and fortunate to be with him, because I think, given I have been a fence sitter, what if I was with someone who wanted kids? Maybe I would have been influenced by that. And maybe now I'd be sitting here with 3 children, hating my life.
Yeah.
Well, not hating it, but you know what I mean.
I get it. Yeah.
A bit flippant. But you know, I think I could probably make either work, and that's part of what's hard about the decision, right, as well. Is if you commit to the outcome, I'm sure you can form a happy life either way. But yeah, maybe I would be really resenting them and like, I can't believe that I let myself think that I wanted children because of them. So it wasn't so much about that, because my partner is different to David in the book, who is a bit more to the side of maybe wanting them or being open to them, but very much sounds like your partner saying like, well, I'll kind of do what you want kind of thing. And then Leah's kind of asking herself how sure she is of, is that his real feelings, etc. So no, I think this one is interesting, because when I write, there are some things that just kind of happen naturally through the like creative process, and then there's other things that are a bit more calculated. And I would say this was a more kind of calculated decision. It was more like when I was thinking about what the book would consist of, I thought, I want her to have a partner. I don't want her to be single, because I think if you are trying to decide when you're single, that's just a whole other layer. Yeah. You're not just asking yourself, do you want to be a parent? You're asking yourself, do you want to be a single parent? Potentially. And I know many women who've done that as well. But I think that's an even higher bar for, are you willing to do that? So I didn't kind of want to add that complication to it, because then, you know, it's not just a pure wanting or not wanting. It's a kind of practical question as well. But equally, I think it was more that I just really wanted to focus in on her decision and her emotions. And I felt that having her partner around would complicate that. I also did want it to be quite a short book. It was, so it's only 48,000 words. It's technically like just under novel length by a few thousand words. But everyone's calling novellas novels nowadays, so we just calling it a novel.
I was going to say, it's technically a novella, correct? Okay.
Well, sort of. I think it's in like a weird zone. I think a novella is up to 40,000, so I don't even know what 40 to 50 is.
Okay.
But anyway, when you say novella, people's eyes kind of glaze over. So putting it a slim novel is the language nowadays. But that was very intentional, and it was actually even shorter to begin with when I was trying to get it published. It started off like about 25,000 words, which is barely a novella. It's almost like a long short story. It's very short. I think a novella is meant to be 20 to 40, so it's at the shorter end. But that was very intentional. It wasn't like I, tried to write a novel and couldn't get enough words out. It was more because I knew I wanted the book to be quite introspective, which it is. There's a lot of her internal thoughts. There's a lot of her going around in circles in her mind. And I also wanted to have that kind of feeling of this pressure, this obsession, this kind of running out of time to decide. And so I knew it would be a kind of quite relatively like intense book in that sense as well. And I thought you can't sustain that over too long. You won't keep the reader with you. By the time she's having the same circular thought for the 10th time, you've got the point, you don't need to hear it again. So you only need to have it a couple of times to understand what she's going through. So so I wanted it to be relatively short and self-contained, and as I said, very much focused on her and her interiority and what her feelings were. So that was another reason for not having David, her partner, around, because I think I was trying to keep it. There are a few other key themes, and there's it's not just all in her head, just to reassure anyone thinking of reading it. Stuff does happen. There's stuff about her relationship with her friends. I think the biggest kind of other theme is her relationship with her mother and her grandmother, and kind of learning about her family past and all of that. But I wanted to keep it relatively neat, not too many subplots or anything else. And I think I just honestly saw David as like a complication. Like if he's around, it's going to be a distraction. So but I think it's interesting the way, in some ways the result of that is still what you described as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in preparation for this conversation, perhaps thought a little harder about it than maybe I would have on first reading, in terms of, okay, why is he not more present? And I think even, just the circumstance of what happened to her, like it seems both realistic and unrealistic she would keep it under wraps, because it's like, I think you'd tell your partner what's happening, but I also can see how you'd not want to tell your partner what's happening, because telling anybody I've birthed a giant egg is like not going to probably be super, well, I don't want to say it's going to be poorly received, but I can see certain concerns or skepticism about what's going on there. So
yeah, exactly. And there's also there is a question in the book of like, you know, what's really going on here with the egg.
Exactly. And like, has this actually happened? And
if he's there, it's a bit harder to maintain any ambiguity around that. I mean, I also had like a slightly side thing that just kind of worked for me as well, which was, I do think would like to show in my books like different types of relationships as well. I mean, I think in line with my thoughts about, you know, whether society's ideas on children are right, I do think a bit about other ways in which society says we should live our lives. And I think it wasn't like my original objective, but I think in writing it and developing their relationship, I quite enjoyed, because I've been long distance as well, quite a bit. I quite enjoyed showing that kind of relationship that is different to some people's idea of a relationship that is much more kind of codependent, and, you know, we must spend all our time together and do everything together. And that's not necessarily my idea. And the only reason I'm bringing this up, because it's kind of a side point to the podcast, is I do wonder sometimes if that links into a personality thing and people who want kids or not. And sometimes I've thought, is the fact that we've been able to sustain this kind of more independent type of relationship at times, not that we don't want to be together, we very much do, but we can do it, and we do give each other that space to kind of pursue you know, our careers or whatever. Is that linked to the idea that we're both quite, you know, independent personality types? And does that relate to our desire not to have kids as well? Because I think for me it's that feeling of a loss of independence if I had children, and a loss of freedom to kind of be able to do what I want to do. And I think I would also find it hard to be in a relationship that was too constraining as well.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that, because although my husband and I have not had a long distance relationship, we also, I think, have a lot of shared experiences, but also a lot of independence. And sometimes the way we relate to each other is like different than maybe what we see with other couples. And I can think of an example of like, when we lived in Vancouver, I would sometimes go away on my own for 2-3 days, just have a little solo retreat. And like, people always are asking like, why are you not there? Are things okay between the two of you? Is she all right? And it's like, yeah, she just wants to go be on her own for a couple of days. Yeah. And likewise, sometimes he travels a lot for work, and he says to me, like, oftentimes, and it's often male colleagues who will say, oh, I'm going to call, you know, my wife, my partner now. And like, oh, are you going to talk to Keltie? And he's like, no, like probably not. I mean, maybe we'll chat like I'm seeing her in 2 days. And so we often, although there's like on the one hand, a lot of communication and time spent, on the other hand, we're both very comfortable not having that. And so I will add that to the list of consideration in this profile I'm building in my mind, because I talk to so many different women in particular, but people that I certainly start to see parallels in terms of the kind of personalities and traits. And by the way, people listening, like, would it be interesting? I mean, I want to be a little bit careful, because I don't want to draw broad conclusions and say, like, if you are this, therefore you're child free. But even just being a fence sitter to say, like, most people or many people have this characteristic or that, I definitely start to see similar things coming up. And a lot of them are people similar to me, because, like, I mean, it also makes sense as like the face of Kids Are Child Free, that people identify with my story and my life because they're similar to me. So
I really identify with that.
Yeah. Okay. We'll have to like put notes together after this conversation and see what else.
Another recommendation for people, whether they're single or not. I mean, I'm not single, but I read it because I'm interested in the topic, and also how, like, you know, having a relationship is seen as a status thing, which I think is ridiculous. But there's a great collection of essays called Unattached. I think it's collected by Angelica Malin. And that's about either people who kind of identify as like single at heart, is Bella de Paolo's like wording, and they kind of always been single, always want to be single, or people who didn't want to be single, ended up single, and then like learned to embrace it, But
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I found fascinating reading that was just getting an insight into how some people approach relationships. And so many of the people, when they were contrasting being single with being in a relationship, I found it hard because I was like, I'm really glad that you're happy now being single. But I also think that you are comparing being single with being in like a very codependent relationship. And there's other way. And there were some things people said about things they kind of felt they were sort of allowed to do when they were single that they felt they couldn't do when they were in a relationship, like things like you just described. And to me, I was like, this is such an alien concept. It was just fascinating getting into people's minds about that.
So, you're like,
really
if that's a relationship, no wonder you want to be single.
But then obviously, like, I'm not judging. Like for some people, that's really what
there's nothing wrong with being single, but
or having, if that's the kind of relationship you want as well, then that's great. And like that's probably who knows? I mean, I think my relationship is great, but I'm sure those relationships as well are great in their own way if that's your personality type, right? It just, again, it goes back to like what your personality type is, and what kind of life you want to have.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, there's quite a few different themes that you explore in the book, which we're not going to have a chance to delve into them all today, but I want to say, like, pick up a copy of Fledging, and we'll certainly link to it in the show notes. It's an excellent story, regardless of where you're at in your journey. And as mentioned, I found it highly relatable. I mean, now having made my child-free choice, I was just like nodding along and I'm like, oh yeah, I've been there. I felt that. I mean, you talk about sort of the tensions that come up in friendships, specifically with women who, when friends start having kids and that relationship with a parent, especially when you've got sort of a dependent relationship there, as I know some people find themselves in, where you see your parent or parents starting to rely upon you more for support and what that can mean for this decision. So lots of really good, as you said, things happen in the book as well as just the things that happen in Leah's head. And so I can only wholeheartedly give my 5 out of 5 star recommendation.
Thank you.
To wrap things up, what can you say about, let's call it, being on the other side of a decision? 99%. Like, was there a moment of relief? How does life feel today now that you've got this figured out? Has anything changed dramatically or not? I mean, I'm just curious kind of where you're at with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a sense of relief, and that was like a concept that I wanted to explore through the book, as well, as I say, of like being released from the obsessing, the going back and forth. So I think, I'm just really glad that I'm not constantly thinking about this all the time. I think about it quite a bit still, but it tends to be more like this kind of daily thing of like, oh, I'm so glad I don't have children right now. rather than like, do I want them? Do I not want them? I need to decide. So it's still a subject on my mind. I think it's hard if you don't have kids, and so many people around you do. It's hard not to kind of think about that, kind of notice it, ask yourself questions about it on a fairly regular basis, or even if it's not questions, just make observations of like, this, I'm glad that's not me. This feels right for me, kind of thing. So I think, that's the biggest thing, is just kind of like not spending the emotional energy on it. It was quite exhausting. And I think then it just gives me feeling that I've decided, I guess with that decision stacking thing as well, I don't feel like there's like pressure to decide almost anything else in my life. I can just make my way through life as it comes, do what I want when I want, see opportunities and think, I'll do that. I'll go to that place for 6 months, or I'll do this, because I'm not thinking, but what if I then want to have a child, and then, will me and my partner be in the same location to raise a child, or all of those kind of things. So I think it's really great to have just a bit more peace around it.
Yeah. Peace indeed. Yeah, it is a relief to have made a decision. And I think it just creates so much like mental, emotional space, but also space in your life to say like, okay, what else can I or would I like to do now that I know I'm not maybe having children, right?
Yeah.
Like even deciding to have kids, it like creates a space of, okay, this is now my path. Let's take some steps forward. So
yeah. I had there's a kind of scene related, or kind of inspired by this in the book as well. I had a well-meaning person kind of had a very brief conversation about this and kind of suggest, oh, well, why don't you freeze your eggs? And I've also got several friends who've been doing that lately because of the age that we are. And this is the age when your eggs stop being useful and you can't donate them anymore. And but I think it was quite telling to me that when it was suggested to me, maybe you should freeze your eggs, what I felt was like, oh God, no, then I'll have to like be agonizing over this even longer. Like, I feel like I'm settled and, every year, as you say, at a certain point, I'll just be made for me and there'll be no going back. And the fact that I find that like a comforting thought, I think also shows to me, okay, maybe I've made the right decision here, because I found it quite stressful, actually, the concept of kind of drawing out that possibility for longer.
Yeah. I think it's a good indicator of your feelings. And I had a different but similar experience, very similar feeling when I realized like there are, for example, books I could be reading about this decision and like other resources out there. And I was like, I was just tired of talking about it, thinking about it, analyzing it. Like I just was ready for it to be done. And again, for me, I think that was like, it showed me like, okay, enough. Like you're as clear as you're probably going to be. And I have to say, having made a decision, like you can become more clear after the decision point, as strange as that sounds, as opposed to waiting to become really sure before you actually decide.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap up, I have 5 rapid fire questions that I ask all of my guests.
Right.
All right. You ready? So the first 2 are finish the sentence. Being child-free is?
Liberating. That's a tautology. That's just saying the same thing back to you.
Liberating's fine. It's an acceptable answer. Okay. Being child-free is not?
Sad.
Good answer. All right. What is one tool or resource that you think might help people with the decision of whether or not to have kids?
I don't know if I would say like one specific thing, but I just think there is so much out there. And I think what really did help me was the blogs, the Instagram accounts, accounts like yours, like We Are Childfree, Ali Hall's blog on Medium. I think, I went down these rabbit holes. I read a lot of these stories, hearing from different people. And again, as we've been saying, we're all different. So some things will resonate with you, some things won't. But it's about reading around and finding things that do resonate with you and kind of taking that to heart.
Totally. All right. What is one thing that you would like moms to know?
Ooh. That people who are child-free don't necessarily hate children.
Yeah, good answer. We don't hate your kids. Most of us don't. Depends on the child, I guess. Okay, and lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence, what would that piece of advice be?
I think really try and dig into how you really feel, what you really want out of life and what's important to you. I think one of the most helpful questions for me was like the deathbed question, like picturing your deathbed.
I like how you laugh.
Well, it's kind of like a depressing, morbid question, but picturing your deathbed, what do you want to look back on, and what would you regret or wish you had done? And I think for me, I don't picture that and think that I'll wish I had kids. I'll wish that I had a fulfilled life. I wish that I had a full life, but that can be so many other things. So that was really helpful to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rose Diell. I said your name right. I called Rose Rosie when I first met her, and you don't want to take liberties with nicknames, let me tell you. So she was very kind about it, but forevermore you will be Rose, which is your name. Tell us, where can we buy the book? Where can we find you? What are all the things we need to know?
So if you're in like the UK, Ireland, or Commonwealth, then you can get it pretty much anywhere. So the best thing is to go to your local bookshop and ask them to order it in, and support your local bookshop. If you're kind of outside of that, so in Europe or the US, at the moment, the main way is to either order it direct from my publisher, Renard Press, and they can kind of ship it to you, or I think it is available on some other sites like Amazon, etc.
Perfect.
And
okay.
hopefully it'll be available in more territories soon.
Yeah, we will. Exactly. We will link to all the things as well as your Instagram over in the show notes. I'm also going to try and include a bunch of those resources that you mentioned, some of the different books that you've liked. And yeah, I always love being able to send people all the different places. But most importantly, first and foremost, get yourself a copy of Fledging by Rose Diell. So
Great.
Thank you so much, Rose. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day and
Thank you. And the sun's come out,
soon.
as you can see.
Yay.
It's nearly in my eyes.
Amazing.
Great. Thank you so much.
That concludes another episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's conversation. Now, if you have not already done so, first of all, I want you to give us a follow over on Instagram. Our handle is @KidsOrChildFree. Otherwise, I will link to that in the show notes. And what I would love for you to do is to slide on into my DMs and let me know, who would you like to hear on the podcast as an upcoming guest? This can either be someone in particular that you would love for me to have a conversation with, or maybe it's a certain type of guest. There's somebody in particular that you are wanting to hear from, whether that be, hey, Keltie, I want to hear from somebody who had kids later in life, or I want to hear from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma, or whatever it may be. Let me know who you want to hear from, who would be an ideal guest, and I will do my very best to get them onto the podcast for a future episode.